John chapter 2, I'm going to begin reading in verse 1, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, but you've kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this they went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they remained there a few days. At the heart of this story, if you have eyes to see it, is the costliness of our redemption. The costliness of our redemption. There are 2 things that the sign at Cana reveals to us about the ministry of Jesus, and through that reveals to us really the cost even of following Jesus, which is what we're going to talk about today. The first is the priority of faith, and the second is the price of fulfillment, and we'll deal with each of those independently. Let's look first at the priority of faith. Look at chapter 2 again, beginning in verse 1. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now it's unclear if Mary intended what Jesus read into what she was saying. It's possible that Jesus sent some sort of an agenda beneath her request that she was not voicing, and he responded to that. But it's also equally possible, because this happens throughout the entire Gospel of John, that Jesus discerned something in the request that Mary herself did not recognize she was asking. Either way, Jesus sees something here that's way more significant than helping a family friend manage a point of shame. And that's really what's happening in the story. To run out of refreshments and provisions for guests at a wedding feast would have been an embarrassment. That was fully the responsibility of the groom, and these wedding feasts often went for days. 2, 3, 4 days, some say even a week. So it's a long festival. A lot of responsibility on the groom and his family. And if they did run out of provisions, they would have been embarrassed. But Jesus and his whole family were invited to this, which means they were likely family friends. And so they might have borne some responsibility to help the groom if he ran out. So it's not an unexpected maybe request for Mary to make of her eldest son. But I want to deal more specifically with the family dynamics that are going on here in the family of Jesus, because this becomes a theme throughout the rest of the gospel. And it's right here in the story. It's the idol of family. It's the idol of family. A few items stand out in this passage with respect to Jesus' family situation. Now, the fact that Joseph is not mentioned after the birth of Jesus in any of the stories of his ministry, we remember that Jesus didn't begin his earthly ministry officially till he was near 30 years old. So he has quite a bit of life that we don't know anything about. I imagine Joseph was alive for some of that. But by the time Jesus starts his earthly ministry, it seems that Joseph is dead. None of the Gospels mention him. And Mary consistently looks to Jesus as the head of household. So it's important for us to recognize that Jesus has probably taken over the leadership of his family at this point in the story. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 55, Jesus is called the carpenter's son. But in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, he's simply called the carpenter. So Jesus had taken over that responsibility, it looks like, and he was the one working in the trade that he had learned from we know that Joseph wasn't his biological father because of the stories of the gospel, but his adopted human father anyway. And so Jesus, as the elder son, would have been responsible for leadership in the family and for the financial security of the family. And that's likely the role he had played until he was near 30 years old. And this scene begins the separation of Jesus from his family responsibilities in the gospel according to John. This is the way D.A. Carson, a commentator who wrote in the Pillar commentary series, explains this scene. We must not avoid the conclusion that Jesus, by rebuking his mother, however courteously, and that's important to say, the way the NRSV translated it, woman, sounds somewhat disrespectful. But it's not a disrespectful way of addressing a woman in the Greek, the original Greek, but it is somewhat not expected to address your mom that way. Be sort of like me addressing my mother as Mrs. Johnson. It would be a bit formal, mom usually works. So Jesus is being courteous but formal, but he is rebuking her. And so D.A. Carson says, we must not avoid the conclusion that Jesus, by rebuking his mother, however courteously, declares at the beginning of his ministry his utter freedom from any kind of human advice, agenda, or manipulation. He's embarked on his ministry. The purpose of his coming, his only lodestar, is his heavenly Father's will. This must have been extremely difficult for Mary. She had borne him, nursed him, taught his baby fingers elementary skills, watched him fall over as he learned to walk. Apparently, she had also come to rely on him as the family provider. But now that he had entered into the purpose of his coming, everything, even family ties, had to be subordinated to his divine mission. She could no longer view him as other mothers viewed their sons. She must no longer be allowed the prerogatives of motherhood. So Mary is doing something quite natural. She's looking to her eldest son to help out a family friend or relative in meeting a need that has arisen that could have caused his family shame. So she says to Jesus, they're out of wine. But what Jesus does with Mary, and he takes steps to do this throughout the gospel, is to remind her, God comes first. Now, Jesus had a very unique mission, which made him make sacrifices that not everyone who follows him will make, though they will make it. Some of you remember that Jesus had a teaching in the Gospel of Luke, I think it's in Matthew 2, where he says, you think I've come to bring peace to the earth, but I've not come to bring peace, I've come to bring a sword, to divide. Do you remember the passage? Husbands from wives, parents from children. Why would Jesus say such a thing? Because the mission of God in the world, for all who follow Jesus, and Jesus modeled this himself, has to be more important than family responsibilities. Now, that's not to mean that families are discarded. Jesus cares about his mother. We'll watch him in the Gospel of John even make provision for her ongoing care when he's dying on the cross. He'll ask John to care for her and to take her into his house as a widow. So Jesus is not unconcerned. He's still following the law of Moses to honor his parents. But what is very clear is that the responsibilities that might have been expected of him, he was not going to fulfill family's responsibilities at the cost of his mission. And you might say, well, how does this affect that? And I don't even know if Mary would have thought that she was asking him to compromise some sort of a mission. But the simple truth is that up till now, he had just been a good son. And from here on out, he was going to be the Messiah, and something was going to change. The question that we have to ask ourselves, and this is why I talked a bit there about the idol of family. So I'll ask it of different people. So wives, husbands, does your spouse know that God is more important to you than them? Parents, do your kids know that God comes before them every single time? Do they know that? Whoever comes first is the idol. Now, I want to be careful. Certainly, God is not talking about sacrificing our children or our families to some sort of institutional power. He's not talking about that. But what he is talking about is that we must never allow our families to become more important than the mission that God has given us in the world. Never. This was actually what God was trying to teach Abraham when he told him to sacrifice his son. But when he asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, God is more or less saying, this son you've waited for your whole life, in whom all the promises of the future depend. Will you sacrifice him for me? The book of Hebrews says that Abraham reasoned that if he obeyed God, God could even raise the dead. For Abraham, following God and being obedient had become so important that he didn't care the sacrifice he would make. That's the Christian story. The question for each of us as families is it clear in the decisions we make, in the schedule we set, in the way in which we orient our lives, that no one within those four walls is more important to us than God? Is that clear? Jesus had to reorient his family's expectations. He grew up in a culture that was way more about family than ours is. And for Jesus to do this and refuse to do what his mother asked would have been considered a sin in Judaism at the time, because he was supposed to honor her. And the way the Jewish people understood honor was obey, make weighty, submit, all those things. And Jesus doesn't do it. And you might say, no, Jesus does do it. He turns the water into wine, which is what she was. No, he doesn't. We're going to get to that. He does not do what she asked. He refuses to do what she asked. If he had done what she asked, he would have been crucified that day. She didn't know she was asking that, but she was. It should be clear to our families, to our parents, to our spouses, to our children, that we do not worship them. God comes first. No matter the sacrifice, God comes first. We must demarcate who God is and make sure everyone in our web of family relationship knows who comes first. Jesus is doing this with his mom, and he'll do it with his brothers. Some of you remember the story when everybody thought Jesus was a little loony, saying he was God and stuff like that. And so his family came to collect him. Do you remember the story? And they said, your mother and brothers are waiting outside. And they wanted to take him out of there. And Jesus said, who are my mother and brothers? My mother and brothers are the ones who do the will of my Father. That's pretty coarse, right? But he's doing the same thing I'm talking about. He's delineating. I'll honor my parents, but I don't worship them. And they don't dictate where I go because I'm following God. It doesn't matter what they want. That's big news in his day, and it's big news in ours. Not only did Jesus declare his glory in this passage, but for John, he begins to declare his loyalties. So Jesus begins to help us to understand that when the mission of God begins to take center stage, even our families have to understand that they're second to the mission of God in the world. We must understand that. Let's look secondly at the price of the fulfillment of the redemption of all things. Look at John chapter 2, verse 6. Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. I usually like the NRSV, but that's not a good translation. The word drunk is not there in the Greek. It just simply says when they've had much to drink. It doesn't even say too much to drink. That's interpretive, just much to drink. I doubt that drunkenness is in view here. This is over several days. Jewish wine was watered down to less alcohol content than beer in most cases because of the world in which they lived, especially at a wedding for 7 days. You'd water down the liquor too. So they're unlikely that they're drunk, but his point is well taken. Usually people's palates are more discerning at the beginning of a 7-day feast than they are at the end, and that's his point. But anyway, I don't like the translation drunk. But you've kept the good wine, the best wine, until now. Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, there are a number of interesting details in this story that for John all matter for the meaning. And so just to put out a few of them, Jesus is at a wedding. Jesus associated Mary's request with his own death. That's what he meant when he said, my hour or my time has not yet come. Somehow he said Mary was asking him to die. I know, you're confused. So was I. We got to get into that. That's an important detail. Third, Jesus instructed the servants to fill these stone water jars with some kind of water. We're going to talk about that. They held between 120 and 180 gallons of water together, and they were used for the ceremonial washing ceremonies required by the law of Moses. And then after filling the jars, what the text seems to indicate, and you can read several commentaries that point this out pretty strongly, is that there was a well somewhere on the property, and Jesus said, draw 6 fill these things with water from the well, which they do. And then he says, now draw another cup from that well. And it was only that cup that was wine. He didn't do what his mother asked. They drew one cup. It was brought to the steward. He tasted it. This is good! He wouldn't have found any more than the cup that was brought to him, unless the whole well started producing wine, which might have been, but I think we would have heard the rest of that story if it was the case. So that's what actually happens in the story. We're going to have to talk about why that is. So as we talk through these details, let's be clear, not what Mary saw, but what Jesus saw at this moment. So they're at a wedding. That's an important metaphor throughout the Scriptures. John thinks it's important too. This is how Jesus reveals his glory. The wedding ceremony is described as the covenant of Sinai in the people of Israel. So it was at Mount Sinai that Israel married God. So that's in view for Jesus. So we're seeing a single wedding, and Jesus is seeing what all weddings represent, which is the wedding of God to the people of the earth in a covenant. So that's where Jesus thinks he is. Mary's request for Jesus to help the host with the short of wine was a request to help a family friend avoid shame. But Jesus sees in that request his mother asking him to handle all shame. That she says, Jesus, we need to help mitigate this. He's going to be embarrassed. Could we do something to help him so he doesn't have to be embarrassed? And Jesus sees in that the whole purpose of his coming. It's actually why I'm here, is to take away the shame of the world. But do you want me to do that right now? Because if I do what you're asking right now, I'll have to die. And Mary didn't even know what she was asking. She thought shame could be handled on a piecemeal basis, and Jesus knows that shame has to be handled all at once. And so for Jesus, what she's asking and what she's actually asking are two different things. Weddings lasted several days, and by the law of Moses, you had to wash all the utensils that were being used to eat every time you used them. That's required. So the law of Moses required dishwashers, essentially. And so they had to wash those utensils regularly. That's why there were 6 stone jars of that size, because it was a several-day feast, and they had to be constantly washing dishes. That probably wasn't even going to be sufficient. So that's why they were there. And so for Jesus, those represent the law of Moses. These are requirements of Sinai. So we're at a wedding that symbolizes the marriage of God and Israel. His mother's asking him to handle the shame that's come on not being well prepared for that. And then he has these water jars that represent the attempt of Israel to obey its own laws. I mean, it's a wonderful moment for Jesus. Nobody probably sees it other than him. And then he says to them, fill the things that represent the law of Moses with water from that well. Fill them all up. And then after they're full, after the law has been given, take a cup out of the well again and bring it to the bridegroom. Who's the bridegroom? It's Jesus in the gospel. Who's the bride? It's the church. It's Israel. So take that up and bring it. And so a cup drawn from the well that filled the jars that represent the covenant of Sinai was taken to the bridegroom, and he then had to drink it. That image comes up again in the Gospel of John. It comes up in chapter 18. Chapter 18, verse 10, this is when Jesus is about to be arrested and Peter has a sword. John chapter 18, verse 10, then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. And this is the bit I'm interested in. Jesus said to Peter, put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given to me? The cup drawn out of that well, this new wine, is the new wine of the covenant of Jesus. And we all know, we celebrate communion regularly, what that wine represents. It represents the cup of God's wrath that Jesus had to drink in order for us to live. This is what Jesus seems bound up. And the apostles later recognized that the entirety of Jesus' ministry was revealed to them at that first miracle he ever did. They saw the entire story of the gospel played out in front of them, from Sinai to the cross. And that's why they say he revealed his glory. But he didn't obey his mother. He actually did not solve the wine problem. He simply used it as an occasion to do a sign. Now, I'm going for the judgment metaphor because I think that's extremely important. While I'm talking about this, you can turn to Jeremiah chapter 25. Jeremiah chapter 25. Wine did mean celebration and joy in Israel. In fact, the Hebrew word for to drink is the same as to rejoice. So wine is connoted with celebration, and maybe there's a little of that here. It's why it was served at weddings. But it's really this cup of God's, the wine of God's wrath that's in view for Jesus, because that's the cup he's going to have to drink. We can go to any number of passages, but here's Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 15. For thus the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup of the wine of wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. They shall drink and stagger and go out of their minds because of the sword that I am sending among them. So Jeremiah takes the cup. So that image is also in the book of Revelation. So this seems to be what's in view for Jesus. When his mother asks him to handle the shame of a family friend, Jesus hears her asking him to handle the shame of the whole world. And so he does a sign to show her the cost of that. And it is that he, the bridegroom, will have to drink the cup of God's wrath. Sin is a big deal, church. It's a big deal. And it is no flippant thing for God to see the evil that we do under the sun. Some of us have swallowed a gospel that is quite watered down, like the wine in Israel always was. It's a gospel that says as long as you're sorry, it doesn't matter what you do. So just be sorry and you'll be fine. I don't know where that comes. I don't know where it is in the Bible. I mean, I see it in the church all the time. Maybe if you take a few verses out of context. But sin is a big deal to God. He destroyed the whole earth in a flood. Do you remember the story? It's a big deal to God. He wiped out the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. He sent judgment on the Israelites over and over again. He sent the Assyrian Empire to wipe out the northern kingdom. He sent the Babylonian Empire to wipe out the southern kingdom. I mean, he killed Ananias and Sapphira when they lied to Peter in the New Testament. I mean, God's serious about sin. This is no light thing. Even Jesus says anyone who leads one of these little ones astray, it'd be better if a millstone was hung around their neck. And that's Jesus, by the way. So you and I have swallowed this idea that sin doesn't matter to God. It matters deeply to God. So deeply, he died himself to atone for it. It cost God the life of his son. Jesus can hardly think of anything else. His mother makes a simple request, and all Jesus can think about is dying for the world. He knows from the time he begins that what he's here to do is to die in your place and in mine. And he can't get a request from his mother without going there. That's what happens in this story. But what the church has done, and I think this is another idol, forgiveness itself can become an idol. So that we've come to believe that because Jesus was willing to do this, our sins don't really matter. And that is a dreadfully wrong conclusion. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was living in a similar time in Nazi Germany. And so he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship, and here's a quote from it. Costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. He's remembering the teaching of Jesus that says once you see the truth, you should sell everything to get it. It's the pearl of great price to buy, which the merchant will sell all his goods. It's the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. It's the call of Jesus Christ, at which the disciples leaves his nets and follows him. Costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And it's grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ, our real King. It's costly because it costs a man his life. It's grace because it gives man the only true life. There's life on the other side of giving it all up. It's costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. You were bought at a price, and what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God. So, church, the challenge for you and for me today is to recognize that right at the beginning of his ministry, before he had become famous, because he was going to become famous, before he had done any other miracles, the first thing Jesus did was proclaim the cost of redemption. And the first thing it cost Jesus was his loyalty to the family that had raised him. That was the first cost to Jesus. Nothing comes before God. Nothing. And I'm afraid, church, I'm afraid that in our culture, many things come before him.